Welcome back, everybody. It is another stage in the growing realization process of the British ruling class that they might be fucked. And that comes in the form today of what can only be described as a dignified victory lap being taken by us here again for having certain of our, shall we say, analyses confirmed to be correct by none other than that mighty but now flaccid organ of the British ruling class, that is the Times of London, which is what you would call it if you were in America. I am appropriately positioned in front of the painting symbolizing the destruction of the Roman Empire. And given how much the British ruling class are fucking obsessed with reenacting the Roman Empire, it wouldn't be a very appropriate end to London if it did end this way. But we now, of course, are joined by our comrade and friend Kit Klarenberg, all the way from an undisclosed location in the future Yugoslavia. Let's stop talking about the past and embrace the future. It's Kit Klarenberg.
Hey, how's it going, folks? I might add that viewer discretion is advised if you are expecting the dignity promised by Alex, because quite frankly, recent developments have induced one of those kind of strangely juxtaposed emotions that you find it very difficult to articulate. That's like a mixture of like shock, numbness, absolute hilarity, and like just yeah, it's very, very difficult to put into words, and hopefully that we will help you understand our positions as we go over this really quite astonishing. And I might add as well that this Times report that we're gonna dig into and is gonna kind of serve as the foundation of our discussions today. It was published on April 24th. Now, that's almost a week ago as of us recording this episode. It was an absolutely seismic announcement, and it seemed to completely miss everybody's radar. Both mainstream pundits, independent analysts and commentators and journalists. No one seems to have noticed this. It came across to my attention quite by accident. But it is effectively what I would say amounts to a Suez Crisis 2.0, without any shots being fired, without any ships being dispatched and then turned around rather embarrassingly upon American orders. It is just it is this is the way that Britain's neo-imperial delusions end, not with a bang but with a whimper. So the headline is: UK could scrap plans to send thousands of troops to Ukraine. The detail here is really quite extraordinary. And it talks about how, in an apparent softening of plans, Britain and Europe are no longer seeking to deploy ground forces guarding cities, ports and nuclear power plants to secure peace in Ukraine. I might add that there is perhaps the most astonishing excerpt of this article is when it states: a source involved in discussions about a coalition of the willing in Ukraine said of the plans for tens of thousands of European ground troops to be sent to the country, the risks are too high and the force is inadequate for such a task. This was always the UK's thought. It was France who wanted a more muscular approach. Now,
if in doubt, blame the French. This is an old rule of British politics.
Yes, yes. But I just think that that particular excerpt, I was absolutely gobsmacked to read it. And yes, I mean, it is a bit like, two teenagers getting caught nicking bikes and they're both saying it was the other guy, not me.
Yes.
Like it was my mate, nothing to do with me, Gov. This is after months and months and months of bellicose statements from Keir Starmer and John Healey, and people like former British officials like Boris Johnson, and senior military officials making pretty concrete pledges to deploy troops and even fighter jets to Ukraine. February 16th, the Daily Telegraph reports, based on an op-ed Starmer allegedly, although I'm sure it was someone in MI6 who drafted it for him. Starmer, I am ready and willing to put British troops in Ukraine. And this was accompanied by an op-ed in which he spelled out putting Britons in harm's way is a huge responsibility, but we must be ready to do our bit for Europe. Starmer says. On February 18th, we were told the British Army is absolutely ready if ordered to deploy to Ukraine. And this is based on British military officials briefing the BBC as they carry out a large NATO exercise in occupied Romania, where months earlier there was a coup overturning the results of an election to prevent an anti-NATO, anti-war, anti-sanction candidate winning. March 2nd, The Standard. Starmer commits British troops and planes for coalition of willing. March 8th, the BBC reports, British troops may need to protect peace in Ukraine for many years. March 17th, Starmer ready to deploy troops in Ukraine indefinitely, the Times reports. As recently as April 11th, the Kiev Independent, the UK Defence Minister John Healey clarifies role of coalition troops in Ukraine, not a peacekeeping force. They will not be traditional peacekeepers, but will support Ukraine's own forces, therefore suggesting that they will be on the front line in the war with Russia. And then we fast forward all of 2 weeks from this, and according to the Times, it was always thought that this was an insane idea, and never ever would Britain dream of even thinking about deploying soldiers to Ukraine. Like, this is a strategy which depends on literally nobody asking, hang on a minute, what have you just been telling us for the past 3 months?
Well, I think that the thing we've said since for the past 3 months and before that is, first of all, that this whole plan would basically depend upon the Russians rolling over and accepting whatever conditions NATO dictated, and also the Russians agreeing that the British and the French could walk in there and not get fired at, because that's the only way that this was ever going to work. But there was no way. I mean, the British military commanders might be wild chauvinists and madmen in some respects, but they do know on some level like what they're capable of and what they're not capable of. And the British Army and Navy and Air Force is not built to take on the Russians. The British Army is built to essentially operate as we've covered before, Kit, a specialist group of military management consultants, essentially, that go around the world selling services to various different British dominated neo-colonial regimes, and it is not built to fight a major shooting war. I mean, they said very early on in the special military operation, one general giving testimony to the Defence Select Committee admitted that they would run out of ammunition within 3 days, and that the Air Force would be blown out of the sky by Russian air defense within a week. So, and they've done in the last 3 years, because that's, it's not a huge amount of time, but it's a significant amount of time. They've had time to actually invest in their forces, build up their capacities, put money and resources behind the remilitarization they say they want. But strangely enough, it doesn't seem to happen. Strangely enough, what you get is all of these really big sounding announcements, but absolutely nothing to back it up. So like they only just, for instance, nationalized or partly nationalized one steel plant that was going out of business, Scunthorpe. But they let like Port Talbot go to the wall and they let other places go to the wall. You need steel to do anything. And so this doesn't look like a government or a succession of governments that is particularly serious about taking on the Russians. What all of this looks like, from my perspective, is a series of manipulations engaged in by Starmer and Macron. I mean, Macron might be mad enough to believe his own hype, I don't know. But Starmer and the people running him know the truth very well. And this looks like, to me, an attempt more to keep the Kiev regime in the game by promising literally the British are coming, the British are coming. Don't worry, hold firm, we'll be there, right with you, right behind you, and keep them in the fight. Or alternatively, or perhaps alongside that, if by some strange miracle the Russians just, forgot everything they've said in the last 3 years and capitulated, then they could like stick British troops into a post-ceasefire Ukraine, and then they will be safe from attack. Because that's the only two ways they get that anything happens. One is that it's just used to sort of bolster the Kiev regime, and two, that it only happens if the Russians basically agree to all the European conditions, which they weren't going to do. So in both cases, it just wasn't going to happen. And it's staggering that nobody asked the question, is Britain actually capable of doing this? Apparently, the only people who asked that question was you, me, and a couple of others.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with everything you've just said, and I think what's important to bear in mind, as we've discussed on prior Decline and Fall episodes, which, as I keep saying, only gain in urgency and correctness as time goes on. So please do revisit our old broadcasts. The British are, when they are paying management consultants to proxy militaries, they are very, very, very willing to come up with completely insane, cockamamie plans, which are fundamentally suicidal, as long as it's other people, particularly Slavs, who they have this kind of visceral contempt for, as did the Nazis, of course. As long as it's other people doing the fighting and dying, they're not so concerned about planning or the consequences of their military actions. We have discussed how Krinky which was this 9-month-long disaster in which wave upon wave of British trained, British equipped, and British directed Ukrainian Marines were sent to pretty much certain death to capture a beachhead in heavily occupied Russian territory. Most people who were sent there didn't make the river crossing because they didn't have air cover. Many who did make the crossing were immediately killed under relentless Russian artillery, flamethrower, glide bomb, drone onslaughts, and then the rest of those who were managed to somehow survive this insane blitzkrieg, that they didn't really know what they were meant to be doing there. They were reduced to trying to escape, floating across the freezing, at times freezing Dnieper River on car tires, because it was just such a catastrophe. Now, the British would never, ever, ever allow their own soldiers to do that. Not least because you would have an enormous number of body bags coming back to British capitals, and suddenly the war, which is a quarrel thousands of miles away between peoples of whom we know nothing, would become very, very, very real. for the British public, and they might turn against it. And indeed, the governments and politicians and military officials who've been pushing this so aggressively and creating this hostile stance against Russia, they might respond very badly to this. So there was no way that they were going to. There was no way they were going to put their own soldiers at risk in the way that they are so keen to when it's the Ukrainians. Whether that's Krinky, Kursk, another British operation which has finally ended, tens of thousands of Ukrainians captured, killed, crippled for life, missing limbs, enormous amounts of the Ukraine entered. Ukraine entered Kursk with vast amounts of Western weaponry, tanks, artillery, all lost. There was a counter-offensive where the Ukrainians had an army as big as Britain's to execute it, and they lost pretty much everything and everyone involved in it to regain 0.25% of the territory that they'd lost in the initial waves of the special military operation. The Britain was, and I think it's important to note as well that there have been several instances while Healy and Starmer have been, banging the drum and talking in all of these uber belligerent, hyper aggressive terms about, what Britain can do, what Britain's willing to do. Actually, there have been both current and former senior British military officials have said this is madness, and we don't have the numbers, we don't have the logistics, we don't have the capabilities to even have a major peacekeeping force along such a long line of contact, let alone what happens if they end up in a shootout with Russian soldiers. On the subject on the subject of Krinky, there are reports in the media of survivors of the mission who just describe this complete and utter nightmare where they're just relentlessly fired on. I would ask all of our listeners and viewers, are you or is anyone prepared to experience something like that mentally or emotionally or physically? I think the answer is no.
No.
So it's sorry, go ahead.
Well, as you say, they're willing to be to essentially throw the lives away of just about anybody else who they get get to be in charge of. I would say that it's not that they don't hold the British working class in total contempt. They do. It's that since World War One in particular, and especially, in fact, World War Two even more so, the British ruling class have been afraid of mass casualty events. On some level, they know that their rule is quite fragile. And if suddenly, like, thousands upon thousands of British soldiers were wiped out in a horrific assault like the Krinky operation, they would face a severe domestic backlash. I mean, it got pretty bad here just during the Iraq War when it was a few hundred that died. And that was up against a lightly armed Iraqi resistance. Go up against the Russian and, as it turned out, DPRK armed forces, and you would find yourself on the receiving end of a very thorough arse kicking. Which would have severe domestic political consequences and could possibly destabilize the British state on a fundamental level. So what they're afraid of and what they're desperate to not happen is the sudden collapse of Ukraine and the image that they have, their whole business model for the British military, which is as management consultants to neo-colonial states, would be blown up, because who's going to want training from the vaunted British military that couldn't even deploy its own forces to Ukraine, and whose training consisted of basically standing there and going, over the top, lads, come on, run quickly at the enemy with no air cover and no naval power behind you, and we'll win by that heroic Slavic spirit. That and the punishment battalion we've got stood behind you, who will shoot you if you retreat. Which, by the way, British military historians like to bang on about these things, like, oh, the NKVD used to shoot people that retreated. Well, it wasn't actually true. In whose army that was true is the British Army in World War One, where you were shot if you psychologically wavered, and also now the Ukrainian British trained army, where the fascists stand behind the dragooned men, the whipped soldiers in the front line, and shoot them if they try to retreat. That's like something that the British and the Americans are overseeing. I bet the British officers really enjoying it and wishing they could bring it back here. The point is, though, that they can only keep this up as long as the image of British military know-how survives. It won't survive this because everybody can see Krinky, everybody can see Kursk, everybody can see what a total disaster these operations have been. And so the British business model is getting blown out of the water, and hence why they have been unable to mobilize themselves to the point where they can even have a hope in hell of going into anywhere in Ukraine without explicit Russian permission. And so you've got this humiliating climb down. And the other point to emphasize here is that the way in which this has come to pass is that now there is open admission from like very reactionary media organizations like the German paper Bild, that basically the fear now is that if this falls to pieces, if the Ukraine war withers away, as you can see here demonstrated by the strange picture of Zelensky being presented to Trump by Starmer and Macron, as if they were two proud parents presenting their troublesome teenage son to an elderly relative. They are getting quite clear that like NATO is finished if the Ukraine war goes down badly, which it will, and the British reputation is finished as well. So this is like the end of the business model, very much so, isn't it?
Yeah, completely. And I think as well that there are two other kind of interrelated points to make here, which is that it was very, very, very clear throughout all of this toing and froing and all of these supposedly significant summits, largely held in London, by which were most recently rejected and by Rubio and Witkoff, that a British and French strategy, if you could even call it that, would be to fake it till you make it. So they were going to continue, at least in rhetorical terms, acting as if their plans were plausible, and that they could be enacted, and that Britain and France were ready to do this. There was that kind of psyop aspect to it, but also as well, relatedly, Starmer acknowledged at various points that any British and French or just wider European deployment to Ukraine would be fundamentally contingent on a quote unquote US backstop. Now, US officials have, ever since Trump's re-election in November 2024, made abundantly clear this will not happen under any circumstances. And I genuinely think that the Brits thought, well, if we just keep pushing forward with this and keep pushing forward and keep pushing forward, that as if this is plausible, that we can rope the US into doing what they're saying they're not going to do. And I might add that we covered this, I believe it was last week or the week before. The Times of London ran an extensive report on how Britain was fundamental to the planning and execution of Kiev's aforementioned disastrous 2023 counteroffensive. And they were pushing the Ukrainians to go ahead with it, despite the fact that the Ukrainians themselves said, we're not ready and we don't have enough equipment. And also there were elements of the US power structure who were saying, both publicly and privately, we think that the Ukrainians should make the most of their unexpectedly large gains in their 2022 2022 counteroffensive, and maybe use that as a foundation for a pause in the fighting, to rebuild, or even to just seek peace, like to seek a negotiated settlement from a position of strength. And it was the British who reportedly, according to the Times and also the New York Times, battered down both Ukrainian and US opposition to doing this by saying, well, the Ukrainians are going to do it anyway, and the Russians are expecting it, and hey, they're not strong. So, so again, fake it till you make it. They managed to get the US behind a counteroffensive, which, according to the Pentagon leaks, the US was well aware would result in at most modest territorial gains. I mean, even that was an overestimate of what actually happened. It was an absolute catastrophe, to the point that Pentagon officials now say a counteroffensive may as well not have happened. Or, all that occurred was that an enormous amount of Western armor and vehicles got destroyed, and an enormous number of people got killed and crippled by extensive Russian defenses, including, landmine fields, etc. So it's like I think that, this was a last-ditch effort, and bearing in mind that Kursk, as I mentioned, one of the key objectives, which was admitted at the time of Britain sponsoring this completely suicidal effort, was that it was meant to normalize overt Western involvement in the proxy war. And it was hoped that this would encourage other countries like Germany, particularly the US, to be openly involved, mark themselves out as formal belligerents. Now, the US, for all of the support it has provided Kiev, including providing it with weapon systems and other equipment, which Biden initially stated would result in World War III, way back in February 2022. Despite that, the US has seemingly been very, very, very wary of direct involvement. And actually, funnily enough, for all of their posturing, the UK has too. Now, I've included in the show notes, there was this rather hilarious, again, reverse ferret in October 2023, when it was the very end of September 2023, where Grant Shapps, in advance of a speech at the Conservative Party conference, he or his people briefed the Telegraph that the British troops were going to be sent to Ukraine to train Kiev's military on the ground, and the Royal Navy may move into the Black Sea. Now, immediately, the response from Dmitry Medvedev, never one to mince words, he stated that any British instructors on Ukrainian soil will become a legal target for our armed forces, and they will be ruthlessly destroyed. Okay. So the Daily Telegraph then immediately amended the wording and content of its article from UK to deploy formal trainers to Ukraine to UK to boost training for Ukrainian soldiers, and Navy may help protect grain vessels, which is, it's a tragedy and a farce and a comedy in 3 acts.
Yes.
So it's like, there actually is, for all, and I genuinely think as well that the mass pullback now has come from the generals, or whoever is ultimately in charge in Whitehall, pulling Starmer aside for a friendly chat to say, shut your mouth, this is not going to happen, it would be absolute suicide. So just we need to stop all of the rhetoric and pull back. And in turn, I think that this it could be. We've discussed before that there are numerous analysts, including independent journalists and pundits who I respect greatly, who have expressed extreme fears about the extremely bellicose, belligerent rhetoric which is issuing from Brussels, from various, from the ever yapping Baltics, from various European countries, and EU officials like Nazi spawn Kaya Kallas. I've always made the point that yes, that this rhetoric is problematic and is potentially dangerous. But the fact of the matter is it's backed by nothing. It is literally backed by nothing. And as we discussed in our last broadcast, there was an article in Politico which I urged people to read in full. It was titled "The U.S. Cavalry Isn't Coming," and it spelled out in forensic detail the extent to which Europe was completely defenseless, actually, because all of its defense planning and infrastructure has, since the creation of NATO, been built on the assumption of American support and helping Americans speed to the front lines. And I mean, the article suggests that, well, Donald Trump's presidency is raising the prospect that, that the US might not come to the rescue now, and this is a major problem for a variety of reasons, because Europe lacks the infrastructure, the intelligence capabilities, the military capabilities, and even just like basic things like the ability to move tanks and soldiers and weapons, at any pace or scale, to the site of a potential war zone. This is all dependent on the US, flying in, or swinging in on a grapevine across the Atlantic. And if this doesn't happen, well, Europe's screwed. But the one aspect of all of this is that the mainstream assumption, as manifested by the Politico article, is that somehow Trump represents a threat to the NATO alliance, and that is unique to him. As I think we'll get into, there was never any intention for the US cavalry to come to the rescue in the event that Europe was attacked. NATO serves a very, very, very different purpose. It has never been about military defense. It has never been about guarding against potential invasion from the east. It has always served to as an instrument of American hegemony in Europe, which has only become more turbocharged since the end of the Cold War.
Well, also, we should emphasize a point again that we've mentioned before, which is that the invasion from the east was never going to happen. It was never a reality, even as far back as like 1949 and the very foundation of NATO. It was always founded on this fraudulent basis that there was a Soviet plan to invade. There was no Soviet plan to invade. There was not a serious one. There were contingency plans that the Soviets had in case, Operation Unthinkable, which was Churchill's mad idea of using the defeated German army as cannon fodder to hurl at the Soviets again, and then nuking a load of Russian cities, Soviet cities as well. But there was no Soviet plan to actually carry out an invasion of Western Europe. What this was always about, when it started as far back as 49, was solidifying the rule of capital in the countries of Western Europe: France, Italy, West Germany, Nordic countries, Spain as well, which of course, even though it was ruled by a fascist, was rapidly incorporated into the American-led defense structure, war structures. What NATO is about is, as you say, holding down American hegemony over Europe, making sure that the European powers don't emerge as threats to American hegemony in their own right again, making sure that moves towards European unity basically wither on the vine, which they all did anyway, and also basically having an occupation force there, and of course covert Gladio operations to operate against the domestic working class movement in each country to make sure that there was no or any revolutionary move in Western Europe was defeated by a combination of terrorism and armed force. Back to, well, the states of Europe themselves repressing their populations, with the US playing in a supporting role in doing that. That's what NATO is. It wasn't designed really to take on the Soviet Union, because if they'd have tried to invade the Eastern Bloc, they would have lost quite handily, I would add. The quality level of like the Soviet armed forces, again, my interpretation, other interpretations are available, but I would say the quality level of the Soviet armed forces right up to the mid 1980s was superior in many respects to their Western equivalents. This is probably where a bunch of American former officers have a heart attack and write complaint letters to us, but I stick by this assertion. So NATO wasn't
and the same
that.
is true today. The same is true today.
Yeah.
You know, like I mean, there is an apocryphal story that NASA invested millions in trying to create pens that worked in space, and the Soviets just used pencils instead. I mean, yes, it's not, that's not true. But what is true is that the Russians have always sought to create weapons that can work, that are simple to use and effective under most combat conditions. I mean, you look at the AK-47, which can fire underwater. It can fire if it's jammed with mud and sand. During the Vietnam War, the Americans who had M16s that would frequently jam or just break were like constantly trying to steal AK-47s from the Vietnamese resistance because they were so much better. And then we fast forward to today, and the numerous Ukrainian, both senior and kind of frontline level military officials and fighters have said, well, the equipment we're getting doesn't work and is not built for actual war conditions.
Well, no, it's not. It's built for display. It's built to be used in colonial conflicts. That's the point, which is what NATO fundamentally is built for. And they didn't even win those. Let's go back to that. NATO was nominally in charge of like the occupation of Afghanistan, and they couldn't eliminate the Taliban. Their Afghan army fell apart when actually challenged. Their record as an actual war fighting organization is terrible, because again, it's not about fighting wars. It's about control over the populations of Europe. And the really tragic thing is that the Soviet Union fell apart in the way that it did, because I would say that there was no way that the Western alliance would have survived this long without that disappearance of the socialist bloc. And given the massive contradictions that exist between the Europeans and the United States, with the British trying to play both sides at the same time, are rapidly coming to light now in a way that will probably end up destroying both NATO and the EU, as we've covered frequently before. So Kit, sent me a series of quotes from a book by David N. Gibbs entitled "First Do No Harm," which mentions and goes into extensive details about the way in which the US viewed the European process of European integration in the 90s and the prospect of it becoming an independent power as a threat, and worked actively to undermine it, which explains also this schizophrenic attitude of the British, given that some of the British ruling class were dedicated to continuing to integrate themselves in the Atlantic Alliance, mainly focused on the United States. Others of them wanted to integrate into the European Union structures. That row is still going on to this day, with Starmer's, again, contradictory position on this, reflecting this long-term row. But it's undoubtedly the case that, as the same way with Japan in the late 80s, the Americans in the 90s viewed the EU as a potential competitor that had to be stopped in its tracks. So we've got here a quote from the book, which I'll just put on the screen.
Yeah. I mean, I think just really quick, just to give like a bit of background before we get into these into these kind of damning excerpts. I think it's important to note that like so in the late 1980s, and you have the collapse of communism across the Warsaw Pact in Central and Eastern Europe, and then during this time, the Soviet Union has been reduced to a reliable US lickspittle by the rule of Mikhail Gorbachev. European leaders, particularly within France and the newly reunified Germany, they started to think critically about the continued necessity of NATO. Right, which was, supposedly a military alliance created to prevent a invasion that never came, and its purpose was thus, rendered invalid by the, impending collapse of the Soviet Union. So in 1991, then French President Francois Mitterrand and German Chancellor Helmut Kohl began discussing integrated defense, security, and foreign policy across Europe. And their explicit purpose was to try and reduce US influence over the continent. So, and this was actually signed off in February 1992 via the Maastricht Treaty, which is, rather, it was very controversial in Britain. And I mean, it's kind of the foundation of UKIP and the long march towards Brexit for for certain elements of Britain's elite and military and security establishment, because they saw greater integration into European defense structures as undermining their traditional quote unquote alliance with the Americans, and the Five Eyes global spying network and NATO, which are two mechanisms by which the British continue to quote unquote punch above their weight in the modern day. So France and Germany also, the Maastricht Treaty explicitly talks at some length about a common defense and security policy. France and Germany began laying the foundations for a pan-European army dubbed Eurocorps. Now, US officials made abundantly clear that they were viscerally opposed to this, and they started warning Brussels, don't do this, while also pressuring European countries not to join Eurocorps. So I mean, it pretty much killed any chance of an independent European military, dead on arrival. But let's get into David Gibbs' rather wonderful book, First Do No Harm, which is primarily focused on NATO's illegal bombing of Yugoslavia. Special on this incoming, but
Yes.
go for it, Alex.
Okay, well, let's call this up. So this is focused on what Kit's just been describing, which is the atmosphere in the early 1990s, where the US is reassessing and trying to hold on to what it's got and implement what I've referred to before as a global system of neo-colonialism. This is what the project for the New American Century was really all about, making sure that there was nowhere in the world that was outside of the American-led system. So this means that essentially this was referred to as globalization, the globalization period, meaning you had like the US integrating everybody into the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, World Trade Organization, integrating as much as they could various countries into direct military alliances to enable them to exercise control over different countries' militaries. It was a very ambitious plan that fell apart within a decade. Now, the European side of this, as Kit indicates, was that there were those in Brussels and Paris and Berlin who did want an integrated Europe to act as a rival to the United States. And this is what this passage is referring to. So this is from the David Gibbs book. Quote reads as follows. European military integration was singled out for criticism and led to a series of incidents during 1991 to 1992. The State Department's senior Europeanist, Reginald Bartholomew, bluntly warned European governments not to set up any kind of caucus which might preempt NATO decisions, while former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger stated that Eurocorps was an attempt to undermine NATO. National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft wrote directly to Chancellor Kohl complaining about German ingratitude despite American support for reunification. Sound familiar? And President George Bush himself issued a delicately worded threat. Our premise is that the American role in the defense and the affairs of Europe will not be made superfluous by European Union. If our premise is wrong, my friends, your ultimate aim is to provide individually for your own defense. The time to tell us is today. Again, sound familiar? The United States began to actively undermine European military integration. US officials lobbied European governments to oppose the French-German initiative, especially with regard to the proposed Eurocorps. According to one account, senior German officials say they continue to feel intense US pressure to back off plans for a European Army Corps and to make unspecified but apparently unending displays of their commitment to NATO. US officials are lobbying smaller European countries to stay out of the developing German-French Eurocorps. Now, from my perspective, I think this idea was always utopian. There are conflicts of interest between France and Germany, which are buried but are very much there. And to a certain extent, I mean, the book talks about this, that the US presence there sort of like welds the Europeans into one more cohesive bloc. Without the US presence there, it's not that the Russians are going to invade, it's that Europe won't be capable of unifying itself. Not really. This was always a utopian dream. But the fact the US felt that it had to go all out to squash it is quite curious and points again to the true role of NATO. The true role of NATO is to make sure that hundreds of billions and now trillions of dollars of US foreign direct investment continue to flow into Europe, and then trillions of dollars continue to flow back. That's its purpose. And that's what this quote, I think, fundamentally reveals more than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that as well that there is a very interesting book written by Richard Holbrooke, who was this kind of like this journeyman American diplomat, and he kind of has that like Kissinger level brazen psychopathy where like he kind of he's open and honest about being a dishonest, manipulative, conniving piece of shit of the highest order. And so he wrote a book called To End a War, which is about how he played a role in bringing the Bosnian Civil War to an end in November 1995. Now, he explicitly talks in this about how well this, you know, the key success of the Dayton Agreement as the settlement that ended the Bosnian War was known, was that it cemented US hegemony in Europe. Not, you know, that, oh, well, we stopped this civil war where, like, you know, hundreds of thousands of people were being, you know, displaced, 100,000 people died. It was this absolutely horrendous humanitarian tragedy, as we were told, was the reason the US was trying to stop this. No, the entire purpose was to cement and reassert US domination and occupation of Europe. Now, what he doesn't mention, Holbrooke, in his book, is that there were numerous attempts by the European community and the UN in conjunction with European countries, and also the then government of Yugoslavia in conjunction with European countries, to end this years before it did. And each and every time the US sabotaged it in order to prevent Europe asserting itself within its own borders. So it's like, you know, it's very, very, very clear that the overarching strategy of the US in Europe has been to ensure a level of political, military, and economic domination. My personal take on the recent talk of an open talk by US officials about pullback from Europe, it's or a downgrading of Europe's importance, is because it reflects the fact that they have actually achieved to an almost total extent that objective. They don't need they're as that Politico article went into in some detail. All European militaries are dependent on interoperability, quote unquote, with exorbitantly priced US weapon systems. All military logistics in Europe are controlled by the US, and ever since those those anti-Russian sanctions, which were meant to turn the ruble into rubble, were implemented, Europe is now dependent on US energy exports, which are much more expensive, to a significantly higher degree than they were before the war started. Germany, which during the 2000s, and also France, which had framed themselves as being they gained significant political points for opposing the Iraq War, we had talk of the comeback continent and Europe becoming strategically autonomous. It's all nonsense. And the US actually doesn't have to invest the same level of time, energy, money, or let alone blood in maintaining that hegemony.
No,
it's done now. There is, in terms of that there is the quote from Alexander Haig, where he it's cited in Gibbs' book, where he talks about how the US troop presence in Europe keeps European markets open to us. If those troops weren't there, those markets would be more difficult to access. This doesn't just cover US military exports. It covers all manner of things. Like, Europe does not have a tech sector. All of its tech companies are American. Many European brands, even consumer brands, are owned by American corporations. They're just badged as European. So you have a continent which has absolutely zero autonomy, in pretty much any regard. There are movements in certain parts of the continent away from this. But I think from the US perspective, having so many countries, particularly Western Europe, which at a certain stage in relatively recent history had the potential to try and become an independent power bloc, just wedged under its heel, they're not so concerned anymore.
No, and there is no serious move, even by those who are described as like the big time nationalists. So AfD in Germany, Rassemblement National in France, Giorgia Meloni's gang in Italy. Like, they talk a lot, but when it comes down to it, they roll with the establishment. And the establishment, basically, it has no real plan or ability to navigate their way out of a US-led hegemonic system. You've seen the French be completely incapable of holding on to their neo-colonial possessions in West Africa, as we mentioned before. The British, not much better. The Germans, not capable of deploying a serious military force and have assets stripped their army to send it to Ukraine anyway. Everybody was gambling on this the war against Russia paying off in a major way. So through the restoration of Yeltsin-ism in Russia, and it hasn't worked. It has not paid off. And now, I wanted just to refer back to what we've talked about before, which is what the Russian conditions are. Now, following a lot of noise from Trump and his officialdom over the last month or two, Lavrov yesterday just simply restated the Russian conditions for negotiations, which are that the starting point is complete Russian control over the 4 regions: Zaporozhye, Kherson, Lugansk, Donetsk, the withdrawal of all Ukrainian forces from those regions. Also, basically the dismantling of any and all prejudicial laws directed at the Russian-speaking population and the Russian Orthodox Church, and the essential denazification of the Kiev regime. Now, Zelensky cannot accept that, nor can anybody who would be in charge in Kiev, precisely because, as somebody from, I think it was like one of the fascist gangs came out and said in Ukraine yesterday, well, if he concedes that, then we'll march on Kiev and kill him. And I have absolutely no doubt that those men, those, shall we say, fascist types, are being encouraged in their point of view by the British and others. Say, oh, don't worry, lads, we've got your back. Don't let that guy, don't let the Kiev guy sell you out. Don't let Zelensky sell you out. Because again, the only point of view that is really unites anybody in the European capitals is the idea of just keeping the war going at all costs. So the Kiev regime can't agree to that, because essentially it would be agreeing to the death warrant of anybody who's in charge of it. The Americans won't force the Europeans into acquiescing to it, because there's too much money at stake between them, and they've already, as you said, achieved a great deal of what they wanted to achieve. They realize they can't beat the Russians. They realize, of course, that even American armed forces, as we'll come to when we talk about Yemen, aren't actually meant to take on anybody serious. They're meant to bludgeon low technology states into submission via air power and sanctions power. So this was never meant to be a shooting war with the Russians. This was always meant to be won in other ways. They can't fight it they can't fight it directly. So what's going to happen is Lavrov has restated what Putin stated last summer, which is the conditions for negotiations. There'll be no agreement, and the war will just continue until the Russians force the Kiev regime into a state of collapse. And everything we've seen recently, for all this dancing back and forward from Starmer and Macron, is designed to delay that inevitability. And it is a horrific act of brutal cynicism to keep the Kiev regime on its feet and to keep sending thousands upon thousands of Ukrainian men to die horrific deaths in a war that everybody knows is going to come to a conclusion. The only thing they're determined to do is to make it come to a conclusion as expensively as possible for the Russians. Did you have anything more to add on that, Kit?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly the objective. Although I do think that, I mean, as we've discussed and speculated in prior broadcasts, and it does bear repeating that, like, actually, I think that the Ukrainian forces are probably closer to total collapse than one might think. So it's like recently, it was announced that the Ukrainian government, as a prelude to forced conscription of 18 to 24-year-old male Ukrainian males, the country's smallest demographic already, the Kiev government announced a very, very, very lucrative, in local terms, sign-up fee for enlisting in the military if you're over 18. After a month, 500 people had taken the bait, as it were. And that's with masses of money being dangled in front of them to do so. Already, like that is a major problem, which there have been several attempts to pass laws in the Ukrainian parliament, which is already basically controlled by Zelensky and his goons anyway, and they've banned opposition parties or scared them into acquiescence, and they failed to successfully pass legislation mandating the conscription of 18 to 24-year-old males in Ukraine. But the fact is that while there is the predictable flurry of stories in the mainstream media about how the Ukrainians are like a fire brigade, washing away, keeping the Russians at bay. Actually, if you look at live maps, the Russians are advancing pretty much everywhere very, very, very quickly. When we get a major collapse of the front line, which could be very soon, then we could see big arrow advances on major cities, including, Odessa and Kharkov. And, the Russians have been building a variety of defensive measures, including, anti-drone netting and electronic warfare posts in strategic positions, which seem to point to the fact that they are planning something very, very, very big. Now, once the Victory in Europe Day is over, that might be an interesting symbolic day. I think that they're going to just start going in for the kill. And we've already seen, significant strikes on Ukrainian cities, which strongly suggests that restrictions on collateral damage, which have been stringently adhered to for most of the conflict, have been lifted or loosened somewhat. And like I've mentioned before, it's like a lot of people have interpreted the US saying, well, if we don't get a peace deal in days, we're going to just give up on, we're just going to give up on this, as the US saying we're giving up on peace negotiations rather than we're giving up on the war entirely. And I do think that yes, the UK now, after so many months of bold pub thumping pronouncements and pledges and insane plans being floated, now saying, oh, well, actually, we always thought that this was a bad idea, and all of that stuff that we said in the past, we actually never said. Is a reflection of the fact that they understand that, yes, the US cavalry is not going to come to their rescue no matter what they do. This does potentially raise the risk of, false flags or provocations. And, that recent, as we had a breaking news on our last broadcast, that Russian military diplomat getting taken out by a car full of explosives near his Moscow apartment. We might get a flurry of incidents like that in an attempt to, stoke things up. But, the Russians are characteristically being extremely careful and restrained. And I think they are waiting until they know to an absolute certainty that they are not going to suffer tremendous losses taking cities before they make their big moves. And, that will be the end of it. Because, at this stage, for all of the, and I still see some idiot pundits claim, oh, well, Italy has got a bigger GDP than Russia. It's just like, it's absolute madness. The West doesn't have the weapons, it doesn't have the vehicles, it doesn't have the industry. It doesn't have the actual wealth to finance this anymore. No. And I think that actually, for all of their statements publicly, a large number of countries would be happy to be rid of this, and by and large have been going along with it because they assumed that at some stage the Americans would come to the rescue. But now that is singularly not going to happen. They're just happy to try and sweep this under the rug. I might also add as well that I do think that we're probably going to see Starmer get removed from his position as a result of this, because as we've discussed before, he from the very word go, within, I think it was a week of him winning the 2024 election, or at least not losing as badly as the Conservatives, he appeared at that year's NATO conference and made all sorts of bombastic pledges about, we're going to fight this to the end as long as it takes, made all sorts of commitments in terms of money and weapons, and since then has made even more with that stupid 100-year deal and with Kiev and blah blah. It's quite difficult to reverse ferret from that. And save any face whatsoever. Not that Keir Starmer has any in the first place, but I think that it will probably be necessary for him to be couped. And I think a lot of the muttering in the media at the moment about his potential sexual proclivities might be laying the foundations of that.
Well, it's very easy to disgrace a man who has done so many disgraceful things. I mean,
Mm,
all they really need to do is just to revive the some of the stories about his actual record as head of the Crown Prosecution
mm,
Service to disgrace him further, or just reveal the fact that allegedly, many people are saying that his marriage is a sham and that has been for a long time.
mm,
There's all manner of things that you could reveal about him that would finish him, and will be
mm,
done. That will be done. There will probably be a quiet conversation had with him where he will be promised a very comfortable retirement, soaking up port in the bar of the House of Lords, along with every other useless reactionary in Britain, to be stuffed into a chamber that now contains more supposed delegates than the Chinese parliamentary processes. That's a country with 1 billion people. So there'll be a secure and very well remunerated retirement for Sir Keir. Wes Streeting or some other hideous, grotesque reactionary will be levered into place, and the government will stagger on for a few more years, making life worse for people. Um, Now, before we leave the frontiers of Ukraine, I did want to just throw in what I'm going to call the based story of the week, which is, of course, the returning story of the deployment of what I'm going to call the forces of People's Korea to particularly the Kursk area. Now, this is very interesting, and I'll admit that when the Ukrainians started babbling on about it and the British started mentioning it, I thought it was probably made up. But recently, Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, and Putin himself have commented upon this. That there has been an extensive deployment of the forces of the Korean People's Army into the Kursk area, where they were trained to integrate into the Russian forces structure, and then went on to play a apparently very significant combat role with backing up the Russian forces in Kursk in defeating and destroying large numbers of NATO-trained forces, and I think it's fair to say probably quite a few NATO officers slash trainers slash mercenaries as well. So this is, I think, quite interesting, given that it was June last year that Putin and Kim Jong Un signed a new defense treaty, and then it was activated quite soon afterwards by the Korean side, providing these forces to Russia to assist in the defense of the Kursk region. And to me, this confirms two things. One is that the Russians and Koreans knew exactly what they were doing when they signed that treaty, and two, by having Korean forces come all the way west to defend Russian territory, it also shows that the Russians will be willing to do the same thing when it comes to North Korean territory. So this very much is a real mutual defense pact. It essentially makes an American provocation and assault on the DPRK impossible to carry out, even more so than it was already. And it gives the DPRK armed forces the modern military experience to integrate into their military doctrines against the South Korean puppet regime, which, by the way, the South Korean puppet regime is dissolving into chaos and madness following the coup of a certain Yoon Suk Yeol, which was probably instigated by the Biden administration. So, best Korea keeps winning, Kit. I think that's a good way to summarize here.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I might add as well that I was likewise very, very skeptical of the deployment, alleged deployment of of Best Korea's forces to Russia, to Donbass and Kursk, as was claimed. Not least because RAND, the Pentagon think tank, they published a paper on how, in advance of news reports on this topic, stating that we should see the propaganda narrative that North Korea is fighting in Ukraine in order to try and cause division between China and Russia. That it was it seemed a bit too pat that suddenly we got all of these news reports. But I mean, again, in such as the endless ability of Ukrainian ultras to try and spin things somehow in their favor. We're hearing a lot now about how, well, this just shows how weak and pathetic the Russians are, having to rely on North Korean forces. North Korea, on top of being a formidable military power in terms of its innovation in equipment, in missiles, and other fields. Their integration with the Russian armed forces is giving Best Korea experience in frontline warfare that no Western military has. Right? Like this is like I mean we've discussed the kind of environments that Ukrainian conscripts usually violently dragged off the street from their families, bundled into vans, given minimal training, and then just bust to the front line. What they experience on a daily basis. But Western militaries are not ready for this. I think that as you mentioned, South Korea is disintegrating rapidly. If you look at polls, despite relentless anti-DPRK propaganda targeting South Korea's population, if you look at polls, South Koreans do not want to fight to unify their countries. So, I mean, in the event that the US was to try and foment a conflict between the two, not only would the DPRK be in a much better position in terms of military experience and capability than the South, but I think that pushback would be pretty minimal. There are a number of positives to come from this.
Yes, undoubtedly, and also I think the point must be emphasized that with this experience, the Korean People's Army is now much more adapted to modern warfare than literally any Western military, including the United States, including the puppet regime's forces in the South. So essentially, this has completely checkmated any US moves they were going to make on the Korean Peninsula, and is going to force a reevaluation, which will further plunge the South Korean puppet regime into even more crisis. So be sure to read the statements from Korean Central News Agency. Very interesting, and also interesting that the Russians chose to make this admission now when they're supposedly in this great negotiation with Trump. All it really shows is that the Russian government knows damn well they're not going to get a deal. They know that the best they're going to get out of Trump basically is that he winds down support for the Kiev regime, which will be the only thing that he can promise the Russians, really. And in that case, it will make the process of wrapping up the Kiev regime slightly quicker. So there is, of course, other embarrassing incidents in the declining and falling Anglo-American empire that we've seen this week, though, Kit, and that includes, of course, a revisit to the heroic nation of Yemen, which has seen the US, very unfortunately, lose an F-18 which fell off an aircraft carrier recently. I mean, that's something that happens to us all, isn't it? You lose a multi-million-pound jet. And this is a story that is being covered extensively now. And it has emerged that what essentially happened was that the USS Harry Truman had to take urgent evasive maneuvers when an attack from the Yemeni armed forces was essentially had evaded the usual countermeasures and attempts to shoot it down. They had to move the ship rapidly, and a plane literally fell off the side. So things aren't going well in the Red Sea for Operation, I don't know, Unlimited Pointlessness, which they're currently waging, Operation Flailing Impotence. And this again shows that essentially, for all the talk of an invasion of Yemen, of like we're going to bomb it until they give in, it isn't working. It isn't working. the Yemenis aren't intimidated by this. There's nothing the US can do that them and the British haven't tried to do over the past decade anyway. And the Saudi, the House of Saud doesn't particularly fancy getting involved in the fight either. So this is yet more proof of further empire disintegration, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I think is really interesting about this is that Operation Prosperity Guardian was one of the most embarrassing US military defeats in history, and I mean, and that's saying something, right? Like, you know, I mean, this was a operation launched with much fanfare at the end of 2023, and there were numerous pundits that said, well, that Yemen is absolutely screwed, and Ansar Allah are about to find out why the US doesn't have universal health care because they're going to be absolutely crushed by this US flotilla. In a sense, Yemenis did find out why the American citizens don't have universal health care, which is because all of the money is spent on a military machine that doesn't work and is exclusively suited and explicitly designed for one-sided gang beatings of adversaries that can't fight back. Now, Ansar Allah could fight back. There are numerous, there was a lot of rumor and innuendo about Ansar Allah having struck the USS Eisenhower, which was leading the Operation Prosperity Guardian, because there was an incident in June where suddenly it pulled the Eisenhower pulled away from its sphere of operations at flank speed. And this followed numerous mainstream reports about how Ansar Allah's drones and other aerial armaments had managed to perforate various layers of on-ship defense, which should be impossible and has never happened before. Okay, so but what's quite interesting here from my perspective is that once Prosperity Guardian ended without any tangible result whatsoever, US pilots came back to base traumatized from the experience of having been shot at for the very first time in their lives. There was an attempt to rehabilitate what happened, the catastrophe. Now, we've discussed this before on prior episodes, but there was a Washington Post article, I think it was published like towards the end of last year, which actually framed Operation Prosperity Guardian as this really heroic struggle that, while it hadn't necessarily fulfilled its objectives, it was still a success. And you know, all of the pilots and sailors involved are returning heroes, and you know, actually, this demonstrated the enduring power and necessity of aircraft carriers, which is, you know, a completely bizarre analysis. And then I believe it was in February this year. We have discussed this on a prior broadcast. Yeah, it was at the start of February this year. There was a report in Business Insider which stated that actually US forces in the Red Sea had defeated Ansar Allah's arsenal without firing a shot. And Business Insider claimed to have these leaked documents which demonstrated that the US had actually won in Prosperity Guardian without having to fire a shot using this special secret technology that wasn't stated in these leaked documents, only they had access to. Now, if we fast forward to when, thank you, Trump's renewed assault on Yemen began, almost immediately there was a report in the New York Times about how Pentagon chiefs were extremely worried about the amount of missiles and other armaments costing millions that were being spent on this effort, and there was no clarity on why the Trump administration thought that they could succeed where Prosperity Guardian failed. Now, I think think that the media focus on this new incident with USS Eisenhower, where they lost, as it states on screen now, a jet costing $60 million fell off the deck of the aircraft carrier because it was turning evasively to to avoid an attack by Ansarallah. Like, this would not appear in the media unless someone in the power structure wanted it to. And what's interesting is there are several journalists, whether they're writing for mainstream outlets like CNN or for kind of more niche publications focusing on the military, have been briefed by US officials that that this was the result of an Ansarallah attack. An official US Navy press release on the loss of this jet acknowledges what happened, but it makes no reference to the fact that it was because of USS Eisenhower undertaking evasive maneuvers. So that suggests to me that the Pentagon wants this over, and they are now, in the same manner that targeted leak to the New York Times seemingly put on ice Israel's plans to strike Iran. This is a way of like trying to, lay the foundations for a withdrawal from the Red Sea again, because it is costing the empire vast amounts of missiles that they cannot replace with any pace or scale. And that they are still, it seems, the empire is still harboring fantasies of going to war with China over Taiwan, and they think that this is a sunk cost which is going to prohibit them from that bigger objective.
Well, I think their wish with China, and I think we should probably cover this like next week, given that there have been massive protests in Taiwan, is to essentially turn Taiwan into the next Ukraine and stage provocations and get the Taiwanese to do the fighting and the dying, whilst the US does the enforcement of a naval blockade. That seems to be their plan. It's also behind some of the moves they made in terms of repressing political alternatives in the Philippines with the arrest of Duterte and the installation of course, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. They're looking for proxies to essentially play the role of cannon fodder for them still. But I think we should definitely come back to that in future episodes. But yes, they can't beat Yemen. They know they can't beat Iran, which might be why they've resorted to terrorism again when it comes to Iran. Hence the large bomb blast that took place in Iran just over the course of the last few days. It's not officially being called a bomb, but I don't think it could be feasibly anything else. And we can guess who are the leading candidates for guilt when it comes to that. But these are things that we'll certainly return to in upcoming episodes. Kit, I think we shall draw it to a close for here this week. I hope you have enjoyed this victory lap, and that grinding sound you can hear in the distance, that is the sound of Paul Mason's teeth being ground together when all his plans with regard to taking on the Russians have come to naught, and he's had too much spice whilst at the Labour Party conference. But I'm sure we will return to Brother Mason in future episodes. Until then, though, Kit, all the way from an undisclosed location in the future socialist Yugoslavia, thank you for joining me again for this one. I would urge everybody to check us out on Substack and, of course, our new Instagram and TikTok accounts. Follow us on Twitter, etc., etc. Thank you for all of those of you who do, and we'll be back with you again next week.
Absolutely. Take care, guys. Keep up the fight.
Yeah, excellent stuff.